I, 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 I. He got fired from Kane, now we ain't got no shame. So we started a pod, Chuck Yates needs a job.
Hey everybody, welcome to Chuck Yates Needs a Job, the podcast. Investigative journalism today. I like that. My guest is Nathan McGough from BASA. Did you know, you and I have known each other, 20 years, something like that. It was literally, 3 weeks ago when we had dinner that I knew what BASA actually stood for.
Yeah, it's very, very technical, for sure.
I like that. Now, before we jump in, because we're going to talk about actually some real stuff today, but before we do that, give a little bit of your background, because you have one of the most fascinating backgrounds of anyone I know. I think you were 12 years old running a commercial bank. Is that right?
No, so I started my career at Capital One, and I had the crazy opportunity to start there when I was I got my offer to start there when I was 17. So,
and are you in high school at the time?
No, I was in college. So I was in my freshman year of college. I graduated high school when I was 16. Started college at 16. And so it was like spring semester, and a college recruiter came from Capital One. They had bought a small auto finance company, and they were college recruiting for it. And so my professor at the time gave him my name, and they called me and took me to lunch. And I was like, no one's ever offered to buy me lunch other than my parents probably. So I was like, wow, that's great. So I went in for testing, and then I got an offer, and I thought I was, going to be the king of the world when I saw the offer.
But this was like a full-time real job, right?
Yeah. So it was a risk position. And so once I filled out all the paperwork and they realized I was 17, I think they assumed that I was, 20 or so. I didn't look it, definitely, but I guess because of the class that I'd been recruited from. And so I got the offer and filled out the paperwork, and they go, "Oh, wait, you're 17. We can't hire a 17-year-old for this position." So anyway, they made an agreement where they said, we want to continue, we want to hire you, we want to honor the offer, but you can start, after your 18th birthday. And so I turned 18 in September and started 4 days later, I guess, like October 1st. And subsequently spent 4 years there as they were growing this auto finance business. Historically, Capital One was all card. And so they were under this sort of diversify out of purely being subprime card. And so they bought subprime auto. And so that's where I spent most of my time. And over 4 years that I was there, I think I had 5 or 6 promotions. It was pretty incredible. So just a lot of growth and a lot of opportunity to learn and take on tasks that an 18, 19-year-old would have never probably been able to take on otherwise. And
Did you ever have to repo a car?
Yeah, well, so I never directly worked in repo, but I was in loan servicing for quite a long time. And so my last title was manager of risk operations. And so risk included, all these loan servicing activities. And so every once in a while, calls from repossession, accounts that were in repossession would get circulated around for training purposes and stuff. So I heard them. I knew, I was aware of them, acutely aware of interesting stories that you wouldn't believe.
That's awesome.
People trying to avoid repossession, or people chaining dogs to their cars or hiding their cars and all kinds of stuff.
So you're there, you're loan shark car guy. How do you get into oil and gas?
So my best friend, we met, his name's Brady, and we met literally our first day of college. We were in a psychology class and just kind of introduced ourselves to one another. And so we became really good friends, and we would hang out, and I was, doing really well at Capital One, and he was continuing on in school, and his father was one of the 2 co-founders of BASA. And so we got to know one another, and he just said, I'd love to have you come in and look at what we're doing and, what my dad's company is doing, and see if, we've got some ideas, maybe you come up with some ideas. And so I got in there, and most of my career at Capital One was involved in analytics, pretty deep analytics. And so got in and I said, let me, if you'll open things up to me and let me see them. And they did in a way that I don't think outsiders had ever kind of seen what they were doing. And I just saw some opportunities that I thought might be interesting. And one of those was diversifying the cap stack to include some private equity. And so we did that. And
how old are you then? When you're
21, probably.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was very young, and I'll never forget. I called the the attorney who built our first private equity structure for us, and had done a lot of similar structures in the past. And I went to the first meeting with him, and I was like 21 years old, and he's probably like, "Who is this kid?" And similar story with some guys that. So our lead bank at the time was BNP Paribas, and so I go in and Brian and Gabe Ellisor and these guys I'm meeting with, and they're like, "Whose kid is this?" So
who's the intern?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so now we've all been friends for 20 years, 18, 19, 20 years as well. So that's how I got in the business. And then once I joined up with the guys and joined the Baysa team, I love the business. There's a lot of opportunities, especially in what we do, to get a hold of levers and move things that are meaningful, and create value. And so once I joined in with them, I just over time took on more and more that I had no experience with, but whether it be marketing or hedging or whatever the case may be, electricity, something we're going to spend some time on today, was one of those things. So it didn't really fit a bucket for a geologist, an engineer, a normal kind of technical oil and gas person. And really, it's just something that someone needed to pay attention to and learn, because it was our largest portion of our LOE. It represents 50% of our operating costs in the field. So
I've got a whole soapbox that I'm going to do something on this summer, because I think one of the biggest problems we have recruiting people into this industry, and you're like a poster boy for it, is we have this whole thing about tenure. I have 127 years of experience, therefore this, as opposed to what young kids can do with an iPhone and data.
Yeah.
And you're kind of going to be my poster boy on,
well,
look, if you give a young, smart person access to data, look what they can go figure out.
You throw smart around loosely, but young I fit the bill for.
In
in
the world of the blind, the one-eyed man's king.
There
So,
you go.
yeah.
I mean, another great example of that would be the Rice brothers. Danny and Toby are guys I've known since 2012. We had the opportunity to hang out together in 2012 and get to know one another. And then I saw them after that grow Rice and go through the EQT stuff. And then they're still doing they're doing stuff outside of EQT as well, on the family side. And that's all really interesting. And their whole approach has just been, let's forget all that's the way we've always done it. And that's something that I learned early in my work at Capital One. We bought this old company, this very small company that was family owned. And, everyone was kind of set in their ways of doing stuff. And so you had all these new folks come in from Capital One and go, well, why are we doing it that way? And Baysa had some opportunities like that too. And we find those opportunities every day. And so,
hang on real quick, because I have to do this every time. Toby, I'll look at the camera. Toby, I love you, but Ryan is my favorite Rice brother. Do you know Ryan?
I didn't even mention Ryan. Yeah.
Right. So
Danny's daughter is in my daughter's grade at the same school.
Oh, gotcha.
So they moved from Pennsylvania down to Dallas. And so we see each other at football games and stuff like that.
Big fan of the Rice brothers. I got great stories that we'll tell offline about Ryan.
Perfect.
But no, so tell me about kind of Baysa and what kind of assets y'all buy and stuff, because I think that's important to the story we're about to talk through.
Sure. So we are consistently looking for acquiring and operating mature, primarily oil-weighted, primarily water flood type assets. So if you said, what does your average well look like? I would say it was drilled in 1950 and makes 3 barrels of oil a day and 300 barrels of water, and it's in a water flood and it's 3,600 feet deep, something along those lines. So just for reference, the old famous East Texas field, we own them, but we're the largest owner operator in the old East Texas field today. And then we have several other water floods scattered across Texas. Historically, we've operated in Oklahoma, New Mexico, Louisiana, and Texas, and we've divested of all of the other states over the last several years. And today we're solely in Texas. We own and operate 6,000 wells here. The majority of what we own and operate on the company's own account, but we do have a couple of private equity partnerships that invest alongside us as well. So,
and I know your lawyers will freak out if you talked about that and all. So I'll brag about you. You guys kicked ass. I mean,
I don't even know if I can confirm that.
Yeah, exactly. You sit there and don't move, don't nod or whatever. But you guys did a really good job because on, I think, 3 fronts. 1, it seems like y'all always bought right. 2, operational, y'all do as well as anyone out there on stuff. And you guys haven't been shy to sell something when you need to, you know?
Yeah. And we, BASA stands for, you alluded to this
Right.
earlier, the highly technical BASA stands for buy and sell anything, or some people say buy anything, sell anything. So, but historically I would say we're primarily buyers. We spend, most of our time trying to figure out, what the next asset we want to go after is. And it's, so I've been sitting in the seat for 18, 19 years, and so many of the assets that we have bought, it's kind of funny how things work out, that we've eventually bought were assets that maybe we looked at some time long ago. And then, we missed it. And one of our other buddies like Lynn Energy or somebody like that won it. And then later we ended up with it. Or, that we made 17 unsolicited, one particular asset, I think we made 17 unsolicited offers on, and we ended up finally acquiring it in 2021. So, we just stay, consistent. We never chase the shale. We never chase the resource plays. It wasn't, we kind of kept it simple, stupid effectively. So, stuck with what we knew and what we did well. And we typically follow and have had our best successes probably following behind the majors. So we buy old mature assets from Exxon, Chevron. I think we bought from each of them at least 8 or 9 times. And so, just buy stuff that's really not critical.
I get that question a lot on a management team. What makes a good management team? And the thing I saw from my 20 years of financing folks, it's like people that stick to their knitting, that understand what they do well and just focus on that. Because it's always when you get outside of what you know that you're kind of just falling into unknown land, And so.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many nuances to our business, and you get people all the time, obviously in the boom times, you get your buddies in real estate that say, hey, I want to get in oil and gas and, all this stuff. And I'm like, there's so many nuances to our business. And I mean, we're going to talk about electricity today, for crying out loud. Most people, when they think about oil and gas, don't think about electricity, but it's for a group like us that's moving a ton of fluid a day, every day. Electricity is our largest cost. So somebody needs to know about electricity and spend the time to do that. And that's just one small facet. And then regulatory changes that are constantly happening, and some of them very quickly and with broad, breadth of impact effectively to the work that we do every day, or that way that it's been done historically. And so there's a lot to it. And the business, I think if you're trying to do all of those things and learn a new aspect of it, or do something different, we have tons of friends who made a ton of money and been very successful in resource plays. And I mean, I look at buddies like Gabe Ellisor. I mean, they Three Rivers, they killed it 3 times in a row, And so sometimes you sit in your seat and you go, gosh, we should have done that. And some of those deals we had opportunities on. And we've seen deals that we passed on because they were resource driven opportunities. And then somebody else bought them for X and sold it for 4X 3 years later. And we go, dang, we should have done that. But
you see that in the casino a lot too.
Exactly.
I should have gone to play blackjack or shoot craps with him. So yeah.
Right.
No,
so at the end of the day, for us, it's everything we do is to try to, buy assets that we know and understand. And then we try to manage out as many of the variables as possible. So we have a very active hedging strategy that starts with every time we acquire an asset, we hedge at least 50% through our forecasted payout plus some return. So we have a rate of return target. And so, we're often buying an asset and hedging 50% of the production for 5 years, 6 years. We do things sometimes like we'll buy out of the money calls above our swaps because, and it's one of those things, I say this about a lot of stuff that we do. Most of what we do that really works well, we didn't do right the first time. And it wasn't, we were sitting around, we had some brilliant idea, but it was, we fell, scraped our knees and said, we're not going to do that again. And that was 2008, oil was $147 in July. And we have $30 hedges from a deal that we bought in 2003. And so our settlements are through the roof every month. And we go, if we had just bought some $80 calls when oil was 30, they would have cost $0.
5 cents.
Nothing, right? Yeah. And so, we would, and what ends up happening obviously is field costs start to go up and they creep up with oil prices. And so you can, in effect, get margin squeeze some, or your margin does get squeezed as a result of your LOE going up and your revenue being fixed by the hedges. So we do stuff like that, and we hedge all of
What I
our
always
electricity.
said, what I always said when I was in the seat is, I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you what not to do because of things we screwed up. You know, I mean, your
Absolutely.
mistakes are your biggest teachers.
Absolutely.
So
And
let's do this. Because you and I went and ate dinner, about 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, and you told me a story, and I haven't seen anything in the press on this. I really haven't heard it talked about in the industry. And so I was kind of sitting there at dinner shocked about it, that it hasn't been a bigger deal. So walk me through kind of what happened during Winter Storm Uri. And for those out there listening, that's when ERCOT almost went down. We had the week and a half of where, all hell broke loose. Was that February of 21?
it was February of 21. Yeah.
February.
So it started Valentine's Day, oddly enough. So February 14th was a Sunday. And, all of a sudden, as the day, and we knew this earlier, the week before, we knew that this was coming. Everyone knew it was coming. To what extent, obviously, we didn't really know. But electricity companies that that are counterparties to us were talking about it the week before. They were going out and procuring reserves and things like that, knowing that it was going to be a pretty bad week. But the night of the 14th is when it really started to get bad, and folks started to experience loss of power just with grid issues, as temperatures. Sustained temperatures over that week of sub 10 degrees in a lot of places across the state. And so anyway, ERCOT, in their normal emergency response protocol, called an EEA1, so an electricity emergency or energy emergency level.
That's
1.
code for shit hitting the fan.
That's the first level of
There
the shit is hitting the fan. So that's like when you see, hey, change the temperature on your thermostats, and conserve individual messages to folks to conserve power, and it's on the news.
Use
and
a
all that kind of
blanket,
stuff.
put on a sweater, that
Exactly.
kind of stuff. Yeah.
And then EEA2 is the next level, and EEA2 got called like Monday morning at like 1 a.m., call it. And at EEA2 is when what are called responsive reserves, or load acting as a reserve. It's LARA is an acronym that's used a lot, load acting as a reserve. When those assets get deployed. So effectively, like, we have all these assets that, huge oil and gas leases and units that produce tons of fluid, lots of horsepower running.
Huge plumbing operations that need a lot of power to run pumps and
exactly. Pumps with 500 horsepower motors on the surface, re-injecting the water that we've produced, and then copious amounts of pumps, downhole pumps and beam pumping units that are producing the oil. And so we're enrolled in this system called LAR, or responsive reserve, with ERCOT, where we have mechanical devices on the grid, effectively coming into our properties. So you have what's called an under frequency relay, and that, when the frequency of the grid starts to drop, it will cut our power. And it's just when the frequency that the grid is operating on is falling, that's a failure effectively within the grid. So, or a sign that there's trouble on the grid. And so that can cut our power. And then we have these remote operated reclosures, which is basically like a big circuit breaker that you would have in your house, but much, much larger, that's remote controlled. And so they send a control signal to our sites to shut them down. So it opens the breaker so no power flows to our assets. And so we have, on any given day, about 36.5 megawatts of power in that system, and available for ERCOT to call on if they need it. And so, and we're one of thousands of folks who participate in this program. Oxy, for example, I can't prove it, but I hear that their number's about 600 megawatts that they have in the system. Again, ours is 36.5 or so. I've heard Apache's is around 20, and they've had more in the past before asset sales and things. But lots of oil and gas operators who are operating mature properties that have a significant load like ours do are in the system. And so Monday morning, that EEA2 got called, which means LAR gets deployed, which means all of our assets got shut down. So everything shut down. And
just real quick, so LARA is a voluntary program.
it's a voluntary program.
Back when the winter storm Uri hit, it's a voluntary program. And does ERCOT pay you to shut down, or pay you for the right to shut you down whenever they want?
That's right.
Okay,
So you bid in a volume of some quantity of power that you have available, and that you have this appropriate telemetry and control on. So if you're going to get into the system, you go and acquire, all of this equipment effectively, and you set it at each of your sites that you're going to enroll, and you test it, and then you enroll it with ERCOT, and then you bid that power in each day in a day ahead market for the following day. And then you get paid a market rate for that. So generators are buying replacement reserves and or reserve power, and so they're buying from you, but it's all coordinated through ERCOT. So there's a market price for it, and that market price fluctuates. And in the shoulder months, in the spring and fall, it may be worth $5 a megawatt hour, and in winter and the heat of the summer, it could be $1,000 a megawatt hour. There's no cap on it like there has been on electricity prices in the past. And so during Winter Storm Uri, we saw it trading at like $18,000 to $20,000 an hour per megawatt hour. So obviously pretty expensive. And the reason why it was so expensive is there was none available, none to be bought. And historically, we've had.
So just to make sure I understand, and my mom listens to this, so every once in a while we got to do the simple down punchline for mom. This is the airline's full, and they're giving you a first class seat and $300 to take the next flight. Basically, that's what ERCOT's doing.
That's a great way to think about it. Yeah, it's effectively you're getting paid to give them the ability to take your power offline. And what that does in effect for the grid is it's the same as firing up generation.
Right. Yeah.
But immediate. Right.
Yeah.
Unlike, you got to go out and you got to do all this stuff. It's literally flip a switch, and there's 30, in our case, just with our assets, there's 36.5 megawatts in the market immediately available for households and whoever else needs it. And so that morning it got called. We've had a LAR event almost every year. We'll have one, even maybe two. Typically they last a couple of hours. So it's a hot July, August evening, 5:00 in the afternoon, the hottest part of the day, whatever. And we'll go down for a couple of hours is what's happened historically. There's never been a time that I know of in the 20 years that we've been involved in this where an ERCOT or a LAR event crossed a calendar day boundary. Well, in this case, it was 4.3 days. They called it at 1:30 Monday morning. And then they recalled it. So they deployed it, and then they recalled it Friday morning at like 9:30. So for that over 4 day period, everybody that was enrolled in LAR was off. So
and how big is that market, the LAR market back then?
Back then it was like 3 gigawatts, so 3,000 megawatts or 3 million kilowatts of power that was getting bid in.
Okay. And so I've never been a power guy, but I read this somewhere. I think the biggest draw, this bottle's been messed up, and I literally sat it down and it spilt water all over, but fortunately it didn't hit any of the equipment. But no, so I was reading someplace, and does this sound right, that the biggest draw ERCOT's ever had on the system was, I think, 75 gigawatts, and that was, I think, August of 2019.
Right. So
you've got 3 gigawatts participating in this program, and biggest draw ever, 75. What's kind of do you know the average gigawatt on the ERCOT system?
It's like 40. Like if you pulled it up right now, it's probably 40-ish.
Okay.
So I think for March, the average was right around 40 gigawatts of load around the clock.
Okay.
Yeah. So 3 out of 40, I mean, you're 7-8%, something like that. So so it's a meaningful amount. And at the end of the day, if what we heard it consistently, and it was all over the news and everything else, and all the reports, UT put out a report, University of Houston put out a report, Comptroller's office has a report. There's lots of reports on what happened during Winter Storm Uri. And pretty much everyone points to that the grid was minutes away from complete and utter disaster that might have taken, a very long time to recover from. You hear weeks, months, whatever. And so we can't fathom what that would be like for our grid to be down for months.
Right.
You know?
Oh, no.
I mean, what do you do? So, so this is in my mind, and I think historically the pricing, I mean, people are willing to pay for this, right? So it's worth something. It's valuable. It's at the end of the day, the ERCOT's job, and as indicated by the R in ERCOT, is reliability of the grid, right? And so
Yeah.
this is a tool that helps enhance the reliability of the grid. It gives you, all these folks that are running consistently. Our load, the shape of our load is flat, right? These pumps run 24/7.
Right.
They don't care whether it's hot or cold. They run, right? They don't care if it's
not an
between 8 and
office where
5.
the lights are on or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's perfect. It's like base load generation effectively.
Yeah.
It's always there. It's always available. They flip a switch and they have our load into the grid to give to somebody else who needs it more. And I think we would all agree that during Winter Storm Uri, there were plenty of people that needed it more than oil producers at
Right.
the end of the day. And so, I mean, look, it cost us a ton to have, all of these assets down for 4.5 days. And it's not just the cost of the lost production. It's the cost of the failure of the equipment from being down. The equipment wants to run. It runs best when it's running consistently. And so,
Well, what does the temperature do? Because, I mean, at the end of the day, stuff comes out of the ground hot, but I mean, I know at my house, I turn on a faucet to keep the water running during a freeze. So,
right. So similarly in our case, you would want things to run. So if you're not running, as you alluded or mentioned, the water's coming out of the ground. In our case, let's say it's 105 degrees. It's moving through the system pretty quickly. So in a lot of cases, we're moving 100 times the amount of fluid that we're actually relative to the oil production that we have. And so we have fields that are producing hundreds of thousands of barrels of water a day.
1% water cut.
1% oil cut. Yeah.
Oil cut. Yeah.
So if it was 1% water cut,
yeah, exactly.
we could be shooting this on the back of a yacht somewhere. But,
Right.
but anyway, so we're moving lots of fluid, and the fluid's moving through the system very quickly. It's not sitting in any one place very long, and it's salt water. So obviously maybe not obviously, but salt water has a much lower freezing point than fresh water. And so we always think, like we all learned in school, standard 32 degrees for freezing water. But most of the salt water that exists in the oil patch is probably around 12 to 15 degrees would be the freezing point. And so to get from 105 degrees that's coming out of the ground to sub 12, it's going to have to sit somewhere for a while. But just flowing through pipes for, a few hundred yards here and there and through a pump and right back out into the ground, or sitting in a tank that turns over 5-6 times a day with, fresh hot water coming in all day. If everything is running, everything works. And then the areas, so we have production outside of ERCOT in Texas. ERCOT covers about 90% of Texas. And then you've got areas in East Texas and in the Panhandle and El Paso that are not part of ERCOT. And so our properties that aren't part of ERCOT aren't enrolled in LAR and ran the entire time and nothing broke, but the properties that are involved in LAR or enrolled in LAR that were shut down, all this water sits in these pipes, freezes, obviously. We were definitely sub 12 and 15 degrees for some period of time. And as it's freezing, then you get into the same issues that you'd have in your home. The pipes break, headers, all of the equipment has the potential to fail as a result of this water freezing and going through that process and then thawing later. And so we didn't lose. I mean, we were very fortunate. We didn't lose a ton of equipment, but we're almost guaranteed to lose a couple of pumps every time we go down. When I say pumps, I'm talking like electric submersible pumps, so downhole pumps that, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a shot plus labor, rig time, et cetera, to replace them, and then lost production. And that just happens because these pumps don't want to be shut off abruptly and then fired back up after sitting there. And if you have any kind of suspended solids in the fluid column that settle down the fluid column as it's sitting there back into the pump, and then you fire it up and just doesn't work out always the best. So we want to run, but there's the economic value of being enrolled in LAR offsets the opportunity that we could lose some equipment here and there. And it's typically never been more than for a couple of hours. So the lost production hasn't really ever been that great. In this case, obviously 4.5 days or 4.3 days it was a different deal. But so we go down and
but
stay
ERCOT
down.
needed the power then. I mean,
Absolutely.
they really did. And so do you have any idea kind of magnitude wise, whether it's you going down or everybody in the LARA program going down, what that kind of meant in terms of other people that got to use the power, whether that's, I don't even know what we'd talk about, households or something like that.
Yeah, there's some metrics that are widely accepted, I suppose. So when I think about our load, 35, 36, 36 and a half megawatts of power, it's probably approaching 30,000 households, somewhere in the order of 30,000 households. And then, if we're 36 megawatts and the entire market is 3 gigawatts, then, multiply that by
9
80
or 10 or whatever. Right? Oh yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
So now we're talking, I mean, even just like, let's say someone like Oxy, who let's say they're 600, or let's say the 700 megawatts that are missing today from LAR, that we went from about 3 gigs down to about 2.3 gigs. So that 700 is missing. That's over 500,000 rooftops.
Yeah.
Based on kind of widely accepted standard average utilization for electricity. So that's a good sized town.
Right.
That could have stayed on because of, this quantity
could have run
of
their
load.
heating, all the stuff that electricity does.
Exactly.
And so, I don't know that I want shots fired at me for saying what happened, but I think some facts, because I went on the websites and basically, they record wind speeds during, periods of time. So while that mess was going on, I was looking through that. And what I don't think people appreciate necessarily about wind power, and like last month, wind power made 50% of the electricity on the grid. I mean, it's not insignificant. Texas is a wind state.
Absolutely.
Whenever they talk about the generating capacity of wind, it's the nameplate. And nameplate means like 25 miles per hour wind, 25 to 30.
Consistently 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
Right.
And you can't go above certain, you can't get certain miles per hour or else it doesn't work. And I think to even produce a little bit of electricity, it's got to be at least 10 or 12 miles per hour. So you kind of have this spot. So one of the things I did is I went and looked at Amarillo, Abilene. I'm forgetting the name of the county that's kind of just west of College Station that has all the wind power in it. And then the largest wind power developments in South Texas. And so I looked at all that. And if you look at kind of, because they give you 8-hour blocks of wind average speed, there was only 1 or 2 8-hour blocks in any of those areas where the wind speed was above 12 miles per hour. So you had kind of the shutdown of wind. And I promise I'm not trashing wind on this. I'm just saying that was a fact. So wind didn't show up. I think another big measure that happened is natural gas has water in it and it froze. So we just didn't have the natural gas production that we normally have. And so a lot of our, what is it, a third of our electricity is generated from natural gas, something like that. So when you don't have the delivery there, as well as natural gas, I believe gets prioritized to houses, to heat houses as opposed to power generation. So you did have that as an issue there. Although one quick side note, I don't know if I told you this at dinner the other night, a nuclear power plant shut down during that whole mess because a sensor that measured the water temperature of the wastewater coming out failed. And so they have to shut down because of that. Supposedly one of the engineers in there was like, hey guys, I'll just stick my hand in the water. It's pretty freaking cold. When it warms up, I'll tell you and we'll shut in then. But anyway, can't do that. So
I saw that stat actually. I was just going through what had failed, and you don't expect nuclear to go down, right? I mean, it's pretty stable power.
Yeah.
So when I saw that, I didn't dig as deep as you did. I didn't see what the exact root of the issue was. But
I was like, no, it's fine.
Yeah,
it's cold.
No, we're good. Yeah, no meltdown happening here. Yeah. So when I think in March it was like 40% or so of 35% of the power generation for the state of Texas, and natural gas is, call it 30, right? We all had problems. It was the perfect storm, so to speak, and it was very uncomfortable for everyone, and it caused a lot of damage, and it was a lot of if it could go wrong, it did go wrong, and we just haven't seen that that I recall. I mean, I don't ever remember a time when it stayed that cold that long. The roads, we got hit with sleet, and then we got hit with snow, and it was just bad. And so at the end of the day, everything that could have possibly failed seemed to have failed, and the natural gas. So the natural gas supply chain effectively, in my opinion, I mean, I saw very little in terms of news about the wind side, right? I knew it had happened because I see ERCOT has an app that's pretty great, and it shows real time. You can see pretty localized where real time power prices are, and it's an indication of congestion on the grid and demand and load and all of that. And so I was watching that real time all the way through the storm. So I knew what was going on. But the news that I heard after the fact was the natural gas supply chain failed.
Right.
It wasn't these windmills were, covered in ice and not, wind wasn't blowing. So,
well, it's that they weren't winterized. That was the problem with wind. It's those greedy energy companies didn't winterize. And it was just like, no, there's really no wind.
There's no wind. Yeah. Well, I don't know how you adapt for that. But so, what we saw very, very quickly, within 120 days, there was legislation passed. So the state, all of the regulators all got together very, very quickly and acted in response. I think within 10 days or so, you had half of the board of ERCOT resigned. Right. So it was the reaction was quick, and it was forceful and strong, and rightfully so. I mean, there's no question.
This was funny. I was tweeting out jokes about each one of the members of the ERCOT board while it was going on, and they shut down the website so that I couldn't access who the board was anymore. Now, I think they were just doing that as a matter of fact, but I like to say my tweeting brought down the ERCOT website.
Yeah, ERCOT.com/board of directors.
Board of directors went away.
Bye-bye.
But it was so I went to the new chairman, and I'm blanking on her name, actually a week before had been named chairman, and she had posted on LinkedIn, "I'm so grateful to join a world-class organization." I was tweeting stuff like, "This aged well," and and everything. But no, so Senate Bill 3, I think, was the legislation that came out. And this is the guts. This is the punchline of what we're talking about today. Because like I said, I have not heard much of a story about this. But what did Senate Bill 3 do? And then let's talk about the unintended consequence, because I think this is really important.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, this happened very quickly. Senate Bill 3 and House Bill 3648 were passed, within 4 months of Winter Storm Uri. And actually, I think June 18th is when the governor signed those two bills. And so they directed that effectively all of these state agencies who have some interplay here, whether it be the Public Utilities Commission of Texas, Railroad Commission, et cetera, that they were directed effectively to do things to ensure that the reliability of the grid was improved. And that included ensuring that the natural gas supply chain was intact and winterized, and things that we've never really talked about or thought about as natural gas producers anyway, And so that came out. The Railroad Commission had its marching orders effectively from the legislature now. And so then they acted fairly quickly to try to accommodate with rulemaking that would prove out to that end effectively, or that desired objective. And so they went to work and they wrote some rules to do so. And so effectively you had the Railroad Commission saying, with quite a bit of pressure from the legislative bodies, to say, hey, we've got to do something here to ensure that natural gas flows. It gets it gets from the wellhead through processing and to generators effectively, regardless of temperature. And so there's this supply chain map. There's a critical infrastructure map. And one of the things that came out of it, well, there's a few things, but one was that natural gas producing properties, whether it be a natural gas well that makes more than 15 MCF a day, or an oil property, an oil lease that makes more than 50 MCF a day, they are now deemed critical. So that was the effective result. And part of that process is that if you're an operator of a property that meets those tests, then you have to file semi-annually, you have to file a form with the Railroad Commission designating those assets as critical. And so it's called a Form CID. And so the first of those forms was due a couple months back, and then I think the next one's due in September. So right now we don't have this critical designation, critical supply chain map to know if our assets are on it. That's forthcoming. And we don't have the rules necessarily for what does winterization mean. But we do know that our assets are critical or they qualify for an exemption. And the exemption would be that they are a natural gas well that makes less than 15 MCF a day or an oil lease that makes less than 50 MCF a day.
Let's real quick for mom's sake, a typical brand new horizontal well, a third or 40% of an oil well's production is associated natural gas.
Right.
So it's not binary, Mom. It's you have natural gas and oil coming out of the same well. Water floods, even though we're talking 1% oil cuts, and you're moving a ton of water, you've got your in effect skimming the oil out of it. They still make natural gas.
They still make a little associated natural gas. So we're not, our wells are making a couple MCF a day here and there, and that sort of thing. So, and the reason why they brought in the oil lease designation was to recognize that, especially out, in the resource plays, you've got these huge wells that are making 1 million cubic feet of gas a day, right? And they're making a bunch of oil, but they are making, a significant amount of natural gas. So they're designated oil wells on oil leases by the Railroad Commission. And so that's why they brought in this bucket. Makes total sense. Everyone's cool with that. It's the threshold that becomes problematic, and then that there's no other test. And so that's kind of where we'll go. So you look at our properties, ton of electricity demand load required to move all of this fluid. The natural gas production is very, very small. We have singular oil leases that have 500 wells on them. So, you have 500 wells and you're making a little bit of natural gas here and there. You're using a ton of electricity to run the 500 wells, and then, the 2 or 3 big horizontal pumps on the surface to put away the water, to re-inject the water, the produced water. And so, really in my mind, and this was the conversation that we were having at dinner, is the best test is an asset should be critical if the value of the natural gas when converted to electricity is greater than the load that the asset has, or, effectively the load that the asset creates in terms of electricity usage. And so at the end of the day, if our asset can make, 1 megawatt of natural gas value, and when converted to electricity, it can make 1 megawatt a day or 1 megawatt hour, let's say, of electricity, but we're using 30 megawatt hours. You would think that you would
That's minus 29. I learned that. I learned that in third grade. So the grid's down 29 megawatts in that situation.
Right. And so you would think that you would not want that asset to be critical. And
does critical mean that it has to be producing in effect when the shit hits the fan?
Right. And the intent is to say, if an asset is deemed critical, then all of the utilities, the grid, will ensure that those critical meters effectively continue to receive power when others don't. So when you get to, I mentioned EEA1 and EEA2, EEA3 is rolling blackout. So that's what we got to very quickly at the beginning of Winter Storm Uri. And so in an EEA3 environment, historically it was kind of indiscriminate, right? You just, this leg of, power supply lines turns off.
Right.
Everyone on it turns off. Today, it's far more targeted. I mean, you saw a lot of hospitals continue to maintain power, police stations, fire stations, stuff like that, maintain power because of the use of smart meters and better technology on the grid today than what we had, 20 years ago, let's say. But the idea is that long term, that every asset that's deemed critical would continue to run and would be prioritized in terms of receiving electricity from the grid over everyone that's not deemed critical. well, your house is never going to be deemed critical, right? I mean, you're a healthy young man,
Right.
so you're going to get, and when there is a rolling blackout, you're going to get displaced effectively. You're going
Right.
to lose power. And at least that we have in West Texas is going to continue to receive power, even though in effect it could be negative to the grid for us to receive power relative to the natural gas that could be created. So the goal is, let's generate as much natural gas as we can. Let's ensure that it's all on, not generate as much as we can, but ensure that it stays on so that it gets through the supply chain, gets to the generators so that we can make as much electricity as we can or need. And at the same time, the net effect of the way the rule is written today is you stay running and you're using a ton of electricity and you're generating very little natural gas, but it's in excess of 50 MCF a day. And the grid would greatly benefit from you being down. I mean, in our case, we've done that math and we submitted that math in connection with our application for exemption. So we're applying for our assets to be exempt from critical status. We don't.
So basically, the legislation said, hey, if you got more than 50 MCF, you're deemed critical unless the Railroad Commission says otherwise. Is that kind of an oversimplification? They can give exemptions to it?
I think the 50 and 15 are Railroad Commission rules purely.
Okay.
Right. So the direction from the legislature was ensure the supply chain stays intact and reliability happens. And then the Railroad Commission had to go through this rulemaking, and they worked with the PUCT and they worked with ERCOT and everyone else. And they came up with a perfectly well-intended plan, right? And as most things are, I don't think anyone was sitting around going, hey, whatever. So they roll out the rules. We all see them. There are plenty of similarly situated operators like us who said, whoa, wait. We participate in LARA, which is a huge resource to the grid and supports reliability in a significant way. And the value of our natural gas when converted to electricity is minimal.
Pales in comparison.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, but the rule was kind of, by the time the proposed rule came out, it was so far down the road, I think, that it wasn't open for interpretation. There were a couple of exemptions. You could file for an exemption. There is a form that you file. It's a CIX with the Railroad Commission, and you list out the assets, and then you have to supply with that. It literally says in the rule, like, justification for your exception, objective justification for your exception. Well, the rules don't say only these couple things will get you an exception. They do say here are a couple of examples.
Okay.
And one of those examples is the natural gas never leaves the lease.
Right.
So if the natural gas is used on lease for some purpose or whatever the case may be, it never would make it into the supply chain anyway. Well, that's a pretty black and white. We get that. Makes sense. Perfect.
Plus, we want to shut you down if you're drawing any electricity in that case anyway.
Exactly.
So, okay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I totally agree with that. So we submit our Form CIX, our request for exemption, so that we can continue to participate in LAR and serve that purpose. And we supply the math. And the math is, it's at least 6, if not 8 to 10 times more valuable for us to be off than it is for us to be on. The maximum value that you could get from the natural gas that we produce would be a fraction, a sixth, an eighth, whatever that number is, depending on how you look at it. There's lots of ways to look at it, but we're not factoring shrink and line loss and processing, and it's got to be compressed, which takes energy getting to market.
Every MCF is probably unique and ultimately where it is on how much electricity, but back of the envelope, if we make estimates and it's 6 to 8 times the amount of power you're using.
Right.
Yeah. Or less, 6 to 8 times the amount of power you're using versus what you could produce, even theoretically that high.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's shut them in.
And Mike, so our CEO, Mike Foster, he's got this great habit of when he's, trying to make a point clear, just taking it to hyperbole. And so, in this case, he would be the guy that says something like, okay, so let's say you're using 8 gigawatts of power and you're making 51 MCF. You still think we should run 8 gigawatts of load?
Have to run.
You have to run.
ERCOT can't even shut us off if they want to.
Right. The grid operator can't shut you off. So I think that makes the point. And then I think the reality of the situation is it probably needs to be 1.1 to 1 or 1 to 1 or something like that. So I think the right thing for reliability, I think the right thing for the intended outcome here for the grid and for operators and everyone involved, but mainly the people of the great state of Texas, is to say, if it is more valuable to shut you off than it is to get to receive your gas into the supply chain, we're going to shut you off, and so that's kind of where this whole thing
Yeah, no, and
today.
that surprised me because I've killed a few brain cells thinking through this, because normally when any industry wants out of regulation, at the end of the day, it's because it costs a lot of money. This really isn't a money grab. This is pure an unintended consequence because, as we discussed earlier, it actually costs you money if you get shut down. Now, if you can participate in LARA, you get paid back and all, but over 4.3 days, that's not enough of everything for you to want to be fighting against this. It really is just one of the things that I don't think the Railroad Commission sat down and thought through. Okay, there are some assets out there that just use a lot more power than they could generate.
Right. And I'm sure we talk about this all the time and different things. You try to paint the brush to get the objective met. And there's always going to be nuances that are missed, I think, and this is definitely one of them. But because I don't think when laid in front of them, I mean, we filed for a hearing. I guess I can disclose that, but we filed for a hearing with the Railroad Commission to object effectively to their denial of our. So play that forward. We applied for the exemption from critical status, and we were denied. And what we heard in the denial was effectively, your gas does leave the lease. So
Right.
These couple little exemption that were kind of stated, known example exemptions, we didn't meet one of those two. And so our objective evidence that we put forth, which was the math to say the electricity value is far greater than the natural gas converted to electricity value. I just don't know that it was even considered. There were hundreds of these applications filed. And from what I've heard, I'm not familiar with anyone who's had theirs approved for exemption yet. So lots of hearings will be filed for, and we'll go through the process. And I hope that the result of that process is just not just that we get our exemption, but that the Railroad Commission is able to rule make around that to say, hey, here's a standard that makes sense. If you're using a ton of electricity in your natural gas, the electricity value of your natural gas is significantly less than that, or any factor less than that, then you should be able to apply for and receive exemption from critical status. At the end of the day, if people are dying, and we lost 210 or so people during Winter Storm Uri, and tons of people displaced in all kinds of very uncomfortable ways, and billions of dollars worth of damage in the state. I think the number's like $80 to $120 billion worth of damage is the estimate that was caused by Winter Storm Uri. And we're out there producing oil that is dilutive to the grid effectively. It doesn't make sense. So,
Yeah. And the thing that worries me and why I really appreciate you coming on the podcast, because like I said, I hadn't seen stories about this and I want to make sure the word gets out. The thing that gets me is, okay, we're going to have these hearings and the Railroad Commission will figure it out and do the right thing. But it's April and August is when the shit hits the fan, And so you kind of wish that the presumption had been, if you have more power usage than your natural gas does, we're going to assign the exemption to you or deem you not critical unless we study and come back and tell you otherwise. That's what worries me, because how long do these hearings take before we figure it out? And this is a shared kind of problem we're going to have. Can you imagine if people, damage, people die, all this because we're out producing oil?
It's not a good look. It's
just not.
We've got plenty of other,
and I can see the headlines right now in the New York Times. Damn Texans produce oil and let people die, and it's
right.
Yeah.
We have plenty of other, things to overcome in our industry, I think, in general. And I think right now people are seeing how important our industry is for the first time in a long time. I think we got away from that, but I still think that folks, it's not the right thing to do, no matter how you slice it, dice it. And so really the issue to your point of August is coming, everyone's been so focused on Winter Storm Uri. I have been as well, but the majority of our LAR events have been called are maybe equally distributed, but they're either, late July, early August, January, February. That's when they happen.
Right.
And the heat kills just like the cold does.
Yep.
I think. I don't have any stats to back that up, but I know people die when it's hot.
Yeah.
So, and it causes damage, maybe not the same financial damage, but it's a bad deal. Now, fortunately, the process here is to be involved in LAR, you have to have filed an attestation with ERCOT that you are not critical. That came out before before we had received word back that we were declined our exemption from critical status. Right. So we filed for the exemption from critical status. We filed we attested to the fact that our assets were not critical because they had not been deemed critical yet. And then once we got the denial of our exempt status, and ERCOT's thing says, are you critical? And not just under our definitions of critical, but under any other regulatory body that defines critical. And so Railroad Commission being one of those. And so, so we go through this process, we get denied. And then so long as you filed for a hearing, you're able to continue to participate in LAR until there's some definitive answer that you are critical.
Ken Lay is technically not guilty of all of the stuff because he had appeals left. But go ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So until there's some final unappealable whatever. Right. So I mentioned earlier, the universe of LAR, which doesn't represent the whole picture here, but it's a significant piece. I think
it's a proxy. We can use it for a proxy.
So it was 3 gigs. It's 2.3 gigs now, and that's just because a lot of people have gotten out because they didn't want to go through that process. I'm actually working towards an asset acquisition today where the folks who are operating that asset knew they were selling the asset. They weren't going to go fight for exemption. And it's a historically LAR participating property. So it hasn't participated in LAR since the end of the year because of this process. So there's a lot of folks out there in that boat. And then you've got all the other folks out there like us who have filed for exemption, who have now filed for a hearing and are still participating. My question is, what is that? 3 goes to 2.3. What does 2.3 go to if we all definitively hear back that we don't get the exemption?
Because I mean, like we were saying earlier, I think the biggest straw ever has been 75 gigs. If it's a gig or two, that doesn't sound like a lot, 2 or 3%. But man, when the shit hit in the fan, those are real molecules that need to be part of the real electrons that need to be on the system at that point. And so
if you were half a gig short and you had access to a gig, or you had access to 501 megawatt hours, or 501 megawatts of load, you'd pay anything for it.
Yeah.
If it meant the disaster that we heard almost happened back in February, I mean, what would the state have paid for that incremental unit at that point?
Yeah.
to avoid all of that.
That's absolutely right. So Nathan, you're really cool to come on and tell this story. Hopefully we'll get some publicity about it and some rationality will take over kind of this process. Because as I said at the time, I don't know what's more embarrassing. Is it being the hub of the energy business and we can't run a grid, or is it we're Texans and we can't run a grid? So let's run a grid, guys.
Yeah, I agree completely. That's the situation where there's an opportunity. There's a great opportunity here to do the right thing. I think that will result in better reliability for our state. And, so we just need to work this process through. And this is pretty technical, like kind of nerdy stuff to talk through. There's lots of other things we could have spent our time talking about, but I feel like it's
and in defense
important.
of the Railroad Commission, because they do get bashed a lot, but in defense of them, this is second order type effects that, quite frankly, I didn't appreciate just hearing about the legislation until you told me, hey, what about this? This is getting caught up in it. So
yeah, it's a big deal, and we're all under significant pressure. I think anyone that has any role to play there is under significant pressure to do the right thing. And that I don't question their intention at all. I don't question the legislature or the legislators' intention at all. Just one of those things that I wish that as it was going through the process that maybe industry or whoever could have provided some more guidance to say, hey
Hey,
guys,
what about this?
hold on. Yeah, because it could represent of that 3 gigawatts that we had in last year. I mean, I think it's very fair to say that it's probably half or better of that. That if this continues on the way it's been interpreted so far, would be lost from the system. So,
Yeah,
pretty
totally.
significant.
So we have to end it on this. I don't know if I told you this the other night at dinner, but my dad goes out and gets solar panels and Tesla batteries on the house. And this is a couple of years ago. And I'm like, Dad, that's great, but how much did that cost? He goes, $125,000, but I never have to pay for electricity again. And I go, okay, Dad, what's the payback on that? And he goes, 12.3 years. I'm like, dude, you're 80. I go, nobody wants you here more to see payback than me, but you're 80. And so
it's
anyway,
extreme buying green bananas.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So during winter, Storm Uri, I didn't think my house would ever get shut down because I'm in the middle of the police department, the fire department, and the hospital. Of course, grid goes out, power gets shut down. I'm freezing. I show up to my parents' house. I got my cat in the cat carrier under my arm. I walk in and I sit down in my parents' 75-degree house because mom likes it hot. And Dad whispers under his breath, 12.3-year payback doesn't sound so bad right about now, does it, Chuck?
So how were they? Was it the batteries they were?
Yeah.
relying
So basically, the sun was out those days. So
Okay.
Dad's generating electricity. The batteries will basically run the house for 2 days.
Okay.
Yeah.
The
So
sun wasn't shining in Dallas. You guys had a little bit.
we had a
different
little
conditions
bit
out
of
in
sun
Houston.
down in Houston. So anyway, Nathan,
cool.
thanks for coming on, dude. This
No,
was
thanks
really
for having me.
good.
It's great to hang out.
Absolutely.